Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Union Podcast. I'm Curtis Valentine, co-host of the Union Podcast. My sister Keri Rodrigues with the National Parents Union is not here today, but I'm so excited to have our guest co-host, my colleague, my grad school classmate, my sister Rachel Cantor. How you doing, Rachel?
Hi, Curtis. I'm so happy to be here with you.
So glad to have you here with us. Again, we are at a pivotal week. And if you are in education, you've been sort of paying attention to an anniversary, a commemoration of something devastating that happened in New Orleans 20 years ago. Rachel is the Director of Education Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute, but also a native of Mississippi and founder of Mississippi First. And so the Hurricane Katrina, which is what we're talking about, hit the Gulf Coast, but also hit states like Mississippi and others as well. And Rachel was so pivotal in passing legislation at the state level in Mississippi to impact education, but someone who was there after the storm and saw the impacts of that on that region. And so we're going to jump into that quite deeply and right now. And so excited about a paper that you co-wrote, Rachel, that you're calling 20 Years of Reinvention and Reform in New Orleans. So talk a little bit about sort of like why this project was important, what information you used to come up with some of the findings, and what those findings were.
Mm-hmm. So as many of you will know, today is the 20th anniversary of Katrina coming ashore on the Gulf Coast, hitting New Orleans very directly, also hitting our Mississippi Gulf Coast communities very directly, and having a devastating impact on the region really for years. The paper that we published on Wednesday is a look back at the last 20 years of reform, particularly in New Orleans, because as many people know, when the storm washed ashore, it devastated the city of New Orleans and many of the schools. People were displaced from their homes. The city was flooded for nearly 2 weeks. People couldn't even get back. There was a humanitarian crisis for people even evacuating the city who hadn't been able to evacuate before the storm. And so it took a really long time for things to get back to any semblance of normal with the schools. And as part of that process, as many people also know, the New Orleans schools were pretty much in shambles even before the storm. The facilities themselves were not in very good condition, but the school district had a lot of corruption. There was a lot of violence in the schools. There was really low achievement. There was a really low graduation rate. There were a lot of schools that were really struggling, and that meant a lot of kids that were really struggling. And so the storm was a terrible thing for everybody who experienced it in New Orleans and in the broader region. But after the storm came this opportunity for a renaissance of New Orleans and a renaissance of the schools. And no one really could have known, 20 years ago when the storm came ashore, what would really happen and where we would be at this place. But we've had a complete revolution of how public schooling looks in the city of New Orleans. New Orleans has the vast majority of schools are charter schools. They have only one direct run school at this moment in time in New Orleans. And that change from a traditional public school district that was really struggling to a vibrant community of public charter schools in the city has meant that achievement has soared, graduation rates have soared. Schooling is very different. Parents have a lot more options now than they used to. They're not trapped in their neighborhood school if that school doesn't serve their child well. And it is something to be celebrated. And there's I think even still a lot of misinformation about what happened in the city of New Orleans and how positive those changes have been, although they haven't been without growing pains. There have certainly been growing pains in the last 20 years. But overall, I would say that the story is a very positive one for children and families.
No, thank you. So if you can, you want to get into some of the numbers, so specifically how are students doing now in New Orleans? And also want to talk
Yeah.
a little about sort of what the lessons are for other folks who are watching around the country who aren't from New Orleans, who are wondering, okay, assuming we don't have a natural disaster that sort of pushes policymakers to act more urgently and to find, dramatic investments in funding, what are some of the things that you're seeing now in New Orleans, but also for those who are listening around the country, policymakers, educators, parents, what are some lessons they can take back to their school district?
Mm-hmm. So let me start first with some of the numbers. So before the storm, the achievement levels in New Orleans were really low. And I do have to say that there have been changes in standards and assessments in the last 20 years, a real increase in rigor among standards and assessments. So some of the data that we have from 20 years ago is not comparable in the sense that those were even lower quality assessments and even lower standards, and students they still did much poorly on those, lower quality standards and assessments. But the city had, only half of kids graduated in New Orleans 20 years ago. And now their graduation rate has shot up. They're around an 80% graduation rate now. And that is pretty much indistinguishable from what kids outside of New Orleans in Louisiana, the rates that they graduate from high school. And 20 years ago, there was this huge gap. If you lived in the city of New Orleans, you might not graduate from high school. Whereas if you lived in other parts of Louisiana, you were likely to graduate from high school. And now that is a completely different story. We also look at actual achievement. We've seen, even with the increase in standards, we've seen an increase over the last 20 years in terms of achievement at 4th and 8th grade with reading and math. The 8th grade particularly is impressive when you look at the numbers of kids who have grown at that 8th grade level in terms of achievement on reading and math. I think that likely has to do with the fact that middle schools are really hard. They're really hard to do well. And especially when you see kids who are struggling in elementary school years, maybe they're struggling to keep their head above water. And then as they get older and older, they get farther and farther behind. And you really need strong schools and strong middle schools in order to make sure that kids persist with their achievement through high school. And we've really seen in New Orleans improvements at that 8th grade level that I think are really critical. And just in general, the state of Louisiana, of course, like every other state, rates schools. Louisiana or New Orleans used to have a whole lot of schools that were rated failing by the state. And in this last year, there was not a single school in New Orleans that got an F letter grade. And that's pretty remarkable, because at one point in time, most of the failing schools in the state of Louisiana were in New Orleans. And now that's not the case. So we've seen this dramatic overhaul in terms of achievement levels. Your other question on like what can people do, or how do people do this? New Orleans has what we call as you know, a portfolio schools model. So the school district has a very different way of thinking about what they do as an entity. In many places in America, in most places in America, the school district runs schools. That's what they do. They run, in Mississippi, we have a lot of very small school districts. You might have one elementary, one middle, and one high school in many places. Or, in a lot of places in America, you might have 2 elementary, 2 middle, and 1 high school, something like that. But the superintendent's going to hire those principals, and the principals are going to hire the teachers, and the school district at that central office is going to control the way education happens in those buildings. That's not how it works in New Orleans. Instead, they have all these partners. They authorize charter operators to run those schools, to hire the teachers, to have their educational model, and they give them the autonomy to do that. And that is a radical difference between New Orleans and many other places in the country. Getting there is pretty messy, because there are a lot of places where that traditional public school model is so embedded in the way that we think of public schooling in America. It's very difficult for people to think about, how to do this differently. And it's also a question of political power for a lot of people. You have elected school board members, you may have an elected superintendent. These are jobs, there's lots of money, lots of power, and the idea of letting that go and letting someone else take control of individual schools, and your job now becoming holding those people accountable, that's a really big shift.
And so when I think about this, as someone who has been following this, like many of you all, had a chance to actually travel to New Orleans in the summer of 2007 with some of our grad school classmates to really see what's happening on the ground. And there were a lot of changes. I think, to your point, particularly in the education system. Would you say that charter schools were the sole reason why you had these changes, or were there other areas, where people were emphasizing, whether it be literacy, math, um, also that kind of got us to this point? You, in the work that you did in Mississippi, really advocated for how we are teaching reading using research. How novel that is. But what are some other areas that people are saying, well, charter schools are an option, but in my state, they're not necessarily as supportive of them. Getting them passed is not as easy. Are there other ways that you saw through your research that New Orleans were able to sort of emphasize within these particular models that you believe increase student achievement?
Mm-hmm. So in the paper, we didn't really talk a whole lot about the different types of educational models that were introduced as part of the change. Certainly there were some, but what I know from other research that I've read is that a lot of charter schools, especially in New Orleans, are sort of on the leading edge of adopting some of these best practices that we see in instruction. And from my perspective, as a person who did state policy for 17 years, the name of the game is implementation with a lot of things. And you have to be giving whatever you can do to set the policy conditions so that teachers are doing their very best instructing kids. That is the entire ballgame to me. Are we supporting teachers? Are we giving them the right curriculum? Are we helping them with training? Are we making sure that schools are spending the time that's needed on reading and math and other things and not being distracted by other things in the schedule? Are we making sure that kids are in their seats, that they're coming to school? Like all of those things that affect the instructional environment, that's where the rubber meets the road for me and for a lot of people, I think, who do school turnaround work or just do education in general. And New Orleans charter schools have been great on adopting high quality curriculum, for example. They were leading that effort in Louisiana for adopting high quality and implementing with fidelity high quality curriculum. And you can't have some of these great numbers that you see unless you're doing the hard work of teaching content to kids in the best way every single day. Like that is your North Star. We're going to show up to school every single day and we're going to give kids a great education, and that's your North Star. And in Mississippi, when we really focused on, the science of reading, what that meant was not just we're going to pass this law and then we're going to tell schools, you go figure it out. There was an entire structure, implementation structure that our Department of Education built around that law, around how are we going to train teachers? How are we going to support them? How are we going to coach them? What materials are we going to give them? How are we going to train principals so that they understand what is being asked of teachers and why it's important? How are we going to invest superintendents in this whole process? And I think that, for me, science of reading and science of math, these things that we're talking about instruction and we're talking about curriculum. And one of the things that I think a lot of the charter schools have really focused on is this issue of how do we increase our instructional quality? Because we, especially in Mississippi and in a lot of places, especially rural places, you're not necessarily going to get this massive influx of, people falling out of the sky. There was some level of that in New Orleans, where New Orleans became a place where people from all over the country moved to be part of the effort to reopen schools. But over time, what we've seen is that those teachers have been replaced by local, people born and bred in New Orleans. And in a lot of our places, that's the story too. How do we make our local people, how do we give them the opportunity to be the very best educators they can be?
And that's, thank you for that point. I mean, because that's where a lot of, you mentioned some of the pushback that I often hear. I would want to be totally transparent about some of the things that people who were there before the storm have said about what the system looks like, who's in charge, whether there were, so-called outsiders who came in. But I think what you highlight particularly is that there's certain school governance systems, traditional public charter, innovation schools, you name it, that offer school leaders a certain amount of autonomy that allows them to do the things that you're very much talking about. Oftentimes, I'll hear people say, "Well, Curtis, there were much more diverse back before the storm, meaning there were a lot more Black educators teaching Black students." And personally, identify with that. At the same time, public charter school systems and the ability to give school leaders autonomy in hiring, in compensation, and a lot of the certification does lend itself, from a model perspective, to recruit and to be more intentional about the educators that you're looking for, compared to a traditional public school system, which, again, as you all know, I was on the school board for 10 years, traditional public school system, and it was rather difficult to hire and in many ways to dismiss bad teachers at the same time. And so I appreciate you highlighting that, Rachel, because sometimes people just get caught up in the term charter and lose sight of the fact that it's really about educators, curriculum, rigor, supports both during school, before and after, and all parental engagement, all the things that are in some cases, in many cases, easier to do, less red tape to do when you have a public charter school model. Any last words particularly about this research that you've done that you want to share with folks that you think people should take away from the 20th year commemoration of this tragic storm?
I certainly agree with you that, the charter school conversation is about a governance model, because a charter school can be many different types of things when you walk in the door, because that is part of the promise of charter schools. We give school leaders autonomy and hold them to high standards of accountability. And we've certainly seen that in New Orleans. There's research that indicates that part of the reason that New Orleans was successful in this transformation is that the district, or the recovery school district that primarily chartered most of the schools before it was reunified with the traditional district, the NOLA public schools, that entity, RSD, actually closed low performing charter schools. And there was this constant sort of look at, are you doing well enough by the kids that we have entrusted to you to deserve to keep your charter or not? And if you're not, we're going to take your charter away and we're going to give it to somebody else who can do a better job. And that process of churn helped improve the overall quality of schools in New Orleans and lifted achievement. And there's evidence to indicate that it was that constant sort of like review and replacement of low performing schools that's part of this story. Now, that churn obviously has an impact on families. It has an impact on educators, because families who are in those schools have to find new schools, and that can be very stressful for families. But in sort of like the broader perspective, it is a huge part of the story. I think there are a lot of people who have a lot of misconceptions about charter schools in general and what they are and who they are. Some of New Orleans, the New Orleans story, there was this tension between, you're getting a lot of young white, especially young white women, coming in as teachers or coming in as school leaders into majority Black communities. They don't know anything about the history and culture of New Orleans. And that was the first wave of people coming after the storm. And there was sort of a tension between, are these people really committed to our community? Do they really understand our community? And over time, the people in the city and the people involved in this effort really took that to heart and said, we have to take seriously this issue of, if you're going to be here and be part of this change, we need our leadership, we need our schools to reflect the communities that we're in. In other places in the country, like in Jackson, Mississippi, for example, or in Mississippi generally, where we have about 10 operating charter schools, all of our school leaders, with the exception of one, but even this year, it might be all 10 are actually Black educators. And the vast majority of teachers in those systems are also Black educators, because that is who lives in Mississippi, and those are the communities that those charter schools serve. Charter schools can reflect the communities they're in. You have to operate with intentionality. And I think that the move to recruit, be intentional about it, as you said, and intentionally recruit people who are from communities that serve, where these charter schools are, is actually really important to the longevity of schools. Because over time, who's going to care the most about kids in a community? People from that community, parents from that community, educators from that community, people who maybe have gone away to college and come back. Those are the people who are going to be most invested in kids. And we should be doing everything that we can to encourage those efforts. And I think that New Orleans took that criticism to heart and has really made some great strides in moving in that direction.
Thank you so much. And I heavily endorse this report. For those who are wondering where you can find it, progressivepolicy.org. Progressivepolicy.org. You'll find this report, read it, comment. You can definitely email Rachel, get your take on it. But thank you so much for this work, and we're looking forward to having a longer conversation with you next Wednesday at 2:00. We'll actually be doing a webinar with Dana Peterson, who is the CEO of New Schools for New Orleans. And we're going to have a conversation about the 20 years since. But more importantly, we want to look forward. What does the next 20 years look like in New Orleans? And how can the country learn from that? So at the same time, we're looking at New Orleans. We're also what's happening around the country that we want to make sure that but also that we're tracking here at the Union Pod. So just this week, you all may have heard that the Trump administration has decided to unfreeze over $6 billion in education funding to states. And so this end of the freeze has led states that were actually suing the administration to drop their case. So 24 states and Washington, D.C. Are really seeking to throw out a lawsuit in actually collaboration with the administration over the freeze of this funding. Happened just this week. And that funding is going to come back and should be hitting in states, particularly by October 3rd. The funding was supposed to come out in July. Again, like I said, over $6 billion of education funding that was delayed by the administration. What does that mean? All right, Curtis, yeah, it's coming out in October, but we should have had it in July. And so these delays really impacted after-school programs, English language learner services, academic support, migrant student assistance, adult education, and professional development. And quite honestly, this inaction has caused financial disruptions, just as schools were finally staffing up and programming was coming up for the upcoming year. And so those of you who are in places who are saying, you know what, there are a lot of sort of back to school things we couldn't do, a lot of delays in bringing services to folks. Hopefully the unfreezing of this funding and funding coming to your states will remedy some of that. We know it's delayed, but we just want to keep you abreast of what's happening, because we definitely highlighted the freeze, but we don't understand now that money should be coming down the pike to places like Mississippi and others that really saw those freezes. And so, Rachel, again, we're following this stuff because we know what happens in Washington impacts a lot of folks, but we also want to find out what happens in cities and states like New Orleans. Have you been hearing from folks? You're in Georgia now, about some of the freezes and how it's impacting families?
Well, as you know, because you served on a school board, one of the most important factors for local districts is predictability in their budgets, because they set their budgets, months in advance of when the new fiscal year comes. And for most states and most schools, their fiscal year started July 1, and they found out about these freezes right before the fiscal year happened. So they had already planned on, set their budgets with the assumption they were going to be able to offer certain services, or they were going to be offered to have certain programs. And there were people that they didn't know how they were going to pay this teacher, how they're going to pay this for this program without these funds, because that was part of the deal. And I think other people have said this certainly, but it's just on a fundamental level. of how schools operate in this country. It was an unfair thing to do to make that so uncertain right before school started. And I think that it's good that this has come to a resolution. It's good that this money is going to go out the door, because this money was appropriated by Congress. And that means those schools and those families and those children that those schools serve are entitled to that money. And it was not fair and not lawful to hold it up. So I do think that it's good that this money is going to go back out the door, hopefully by October, as you said. But it's just such a shame that we are in a place where we are calling into question whether or not people can provide services to children.
That's right. I mean, last week we highlighted the percentage of teachers who actually had to come out of their own pocket to fund decorating their classrooms, fund, basic materials for this school. Over 90% of teachers reported they had to come out of their own pocket. Pockets that were already impacted by a lot of things that are coming out of administration: tariffs, higher costs for food, for fuel, for a lot of things. And so again, teachers out there, we appreciate you. You actually going the extra mile, and hopefully some relief is coming. That's our time, folks. The Union Podcast. Again, we get you in, get you out, 30 minutes. Again, definitely appreciate my sister Rachel Cantor with her new report. Again, go to progressivepolicy.org to read about that. Join us next Wednesday at 2:00 for an amazing webinar. Keep tracking what we're doing. We're keeping track of what's happening in Washington, but around the country. Last but not least, every week we're looking for a legislative champion. This week we want you all to continue nominating folks. Any state, local, federal legislators who you believe are really championing education and believe are fighting for those. And we want to make sure we highlight those folks. Often being an elected official, you think this is all glory. Sometimes it's really thankless job that oftentimes that because of the things they're fighting for don't get a lot of attention. We want to be able to do that. And so again, we'll be back next week. Keri will be back with me, and we'll be back every week. The Union Podcast with research, politics, policy, polling, and advocacy for education. Rachel, thank you so much for joining me today, Rachel. Good seeing you. And we'll be back next week with the Union Pod. You all have a great day.